Right, and I would like to introduce Jessica Halofsky, who is sitting in, I believe she's up at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I don't want to take up any more of her time. So Jessica, if you are ready, we're ready for you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Janine. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that I did for my dissertation at Oregon State with Dave Hibbs. So this is work I've been away from for a few years, but it's fun to come back. So we know that riparian areas are some of the most diverse, complex, and dynamic terrestrial habitats, and areas that are critical for both habitat and water quality in Western systems. And the ecological diversity in riparian areas is maintained by a variety of natural disturbances, including fire. And although we have quite a bit of information about fire in upland systems, there's relatively little information about fire in riparian areas. And in the literature, there's a bit of a lack of consensus on how fire severity in riparian areas compares to that in uplands. Some studies have found that riparian areas are kind of fire refugia and actually burn with lower severity or not at all compared to adjacent uplands. While other studies have found that riparian areas burn as severely or even more severely than uplands, and some studies have reported a kind of chimney effect in steep drainages. And these discrepancies in how fire in riparian areas compares to that in uplands are likely due to variation in properties of riparian areas that control fire behavior. So these could include the fuels in riparian areas, variation in species composition, fine fuel levels, the local topography, how large the stream is, the slope in and around a riparian area, the valley floor width. And also, we know that the fire severity in uplands likely influences riparian fire behavior. So I had three main research questions about fire in riparian areas. The first was simply, how does fire severity in riparian areas compare to that in uplands? And then what factors are associated with fire severity in riparian areas? What are the controls on it? And then I was also interested in looking at post-fire vegetation recovery in riparian areas after fire. So I'm going to go through some general methods and then specific methods, results, and conclusions for each of these three research questions. So I explored these questions in two fires in Oregon. The Biscuit Fire, I think you're all probably familiar with. It was located in Siskiyou National Forest and BLM land in Southwest Oregon in 2002. The fire covered an area of over 200,000 hectares, making it the largest fire in Oregon's recorded history. The B&B Complex fire was the result of the merging of two lightning-caused fires on the east slope of the Cascades in the Deschutes and Willamette National Forests in 2003. That fire covered an area of approximately 37,000 hectares. Now, there's some differences in species composition and topography between these two fires, which I just wanted to highlight briefly. In the Biscuit Fire, we have mixed conifer forest, but with a strong evergreen hardwood component. The B&B Complex Fire had more ponderosa pine in addition to mixed conifer forests. The topography in the Biscuit Fire area is quite steep and complex, whereas the topography in the B&B Fire was a little more gentle to moderately steep. And there are also some hydrological differences. The primary stream sources in the Biscuit Fire are surface runoff, whereas we have a strong spring and groundwater component in the B&B Complex fire. So with these differences, one would expect some differences potentially in patterns of fire severity and post-fire vegetation recovery in riparian areas. So in the Biscuit Fire, I sampled 2 watersheds, and I chose the watersheds based on the variation in fire severity within the watersheds, because I wanted to make sure I sampled across a range of fire severities. And I also chose these watersheds based on the differences in plant associations between the watersheds. The eastern watershed was a drier tan oak plant association, whereas the western watershed had more of a coastal influence and a little moist tan oak plant association. So I wanted to basically sample the range of productivity in the fire area. And then the sampling was also stratified by fire severity, stream size, and forest size class. In the B&B Complex fire, I first stratified my sampling by plant association instead of watershed, and included the ponderosa pine, dry mixed conifer, and wet mixed conifer plant associations. So again, kind of that gradient from dry to wet, low elevation to high elevation. And then again, stratified sampling by fire severity, stream size, and forest size class. This just gives an overview that in both fires, the sampling was conducted 2 years after the fire. And then again, the factors that I stratified the sampling by. So at each randomly selected points, I established 3 plots. One in the riparian area, which was directly adjacent to and parallel to the stream. It was 5 by 25 meters on each side of the stream. And then 2 upland plots were established, and these were 25 meters in elevation above the stream in the Biscuit Fire, and 150 meters away from the stream in the B&B Complex fire. Each of these upland plots was 10 by 25 meters. And in each plot, I did an assessment of fire severity that included basal area mortality. So we measured species and DBH of all individuals greater than 5 centimeters in diameter, and determine whether they were live or dead to assess basal area mortality. And then I measured percent of crown scorch and scorch height, or the height of bull char, on the 3 tallest trees in each plot. And then did a visual assessment of exposed mineral soil in each plot. And we originally expected these 4 measures of fire severity to be pretty highly correlated, and to use them to come up with a kind of composite index of fire severity. But we found that although the basal area mortality and crown scorch were highly related, and we thought of these as measures of overstory fire severity, we found these to be strongly related, and scorch height and exposed mineral soil to be strongly related. But the 2 measures of overstory fire severity were not strongly related to the 2 understory measures of fire severity. So for this reason, we looked at all 4 measures of fire severity separately when we were comparing riparian fire severity to upland fire severity. So here we have all 4 measures. We've got on the x-axis basal area mortality, crown scorch, and exposed mineral soil on a percentage scale on the left-hand y-axis, and scorch height in meters. And we've got riparian fire severity in yellow, upland fire severity in red, and the difference in letters suggests a statistically significant difference between upland and riparian fire severity. So we had, for this, these are the results for the Biscuit Fire. We had both exposed mineral soil and scorch height were significantly lower in riparian areas compared to uplands, but there were no significant differences between percent crown scorch and dead basal area mortality in the riparian areas and adjacent uplands. Here we're adding the results for the B&B, and the same patterns held. Again, the two kind of understory measures of fire severity were lower in riparian areas compared to uplands, but there was no significant difference in the sort of overstory measures of fire severity in riparian areas versus uplands. So how did fire severity in riparian areas compare to that in uplands? The answer to the question really depended on which fire severity measure we were talking about. There seemed to be a disconnect between the understory fire severity in riparian areas versus uplands. We found that the understory effects of fire were less severe in the riparian areas compared to uplands. But the levels of crown scorch and basal area mortality were just as high. This is likely due to the lower height to live crown and susceptibility to fire of the hardwood species that are dominant in riparian areas. And the moisture levels in the riparian areas are likely leading to that lower levels of soil damage and scorch height. I can pause here if we have any questions as I go along. Please feel free to type them in. I'm happy to answer them. If not, we can move on to the second research question, which is what factors are associated with fire severity in riparian areas. So for this analysis, because the difference between these fire severity variables and the fact that they weren't all highly correlated, I chose two fire severity variables as a response. One overstory measure, which is basal area mortality, and one understory measure, which was exposed mineral soil. And we came up with some hypotheses on what factors we thought could be related to riparian fire severity. And I put these factors into three main categories, including fuels, upland fire severity, and local topography. And then had specific variables associated with each of these three main categories. And no two variables in the same category were put in the same candidate regression model. So I came up with a set of 1, 2, and 3 factor regression models explaining riparian fire severity using these different factors. But again, no two factors from the same category were put in the same model. So again, we developed this set of candidate regression models. We had 2 different measures of fire severity. So there were 4 analyses in total, 2 fire severity measures for each of the 2 fires. And I used a method which is model selection with Akeiki's information criterion to determine which factors were most strongly related to riparian fire severity in both fires. So I'm going to give you some results here in this table. I'm going to list the factors in order of importance, and they're going to be color-coded according to whether it was an upland fire severity, fuels, or local topography variable. And the plus or minus indicates whether it's a positive or negative relationship with fire severity. So we found that upland fire severity was strongly positively related to riparian fire severity in both fires. And this makes sense since high fire intensity in an upland forest can lead to greater preheating and higher fire intensity in nearby riparian areas and vice versa. We also found that a number of fuels variables were related to riparian fire severity. In the Biscuit Fire, small stem number was positively related to basal area mortality. This is kind of an indication of the fine fuel component in the riparian area. But hardwood basal area was negatively related to exposed mineral soil in the Biscuit Fire. And, the hardwoods serve as kind of a microsite indicator. So greater hardwood basal area would indicate wetter conditions, which could lead to lower fire severity in riparian areas. And in the B&B Complex fire, we found that the riparian basal area mortality was higher in the ponderosa pine plant association than in the wet mixed conifer plant association. And the ponderosa pine plots actually had a greater component of fire-sensitive hardwood species that made up a significant proportion of the dead basal area, which led to a higher percentage of basal area mortality in those plots. And then finally, we had two measures of slope being positively related to exposed mineral soil in both fires. So, greater slope is generally associated with higher fire severity since the steeper slopes are drier and the slopes tilt the flames toward the ground, resulting in increased preheating, fire intensity, and rate of spread. So overall, I came up with some little illustrations. We found that the fuels and topographic factors that were found to influence fire severity in the Biscuit Fire are factors that are also vary with position in a watershed in the Siskiyous. And we have these headwater streams, generally have a higher stream gradient, higher small stem number, a lower deciduous hardwood component, and we generally saw that these riparian areas experienced higher fire severity than these more main stem stream channels with low stream gradient, low stem number, a higher deciduous hardwood component. Those areas generally experienced lower fire severity. In the B&B Complex fire, the factors associated with elevation and plant association seem to be strongly related to riparian fire severity. And we had these dry and wet mixed mixed conifer riparian areas. They're at relatively high elevation, steeper topography. They generally have higher moisture and conifer basal area. Now, these areas had lower overstory fire severity, so lower mortality, but more soil damage. Whereas in the ponderosa pine plant association, these are at lower elevations, more gentle topography, generally lower moisture. They had higher basal area mortality, but lower soil damage. So overall, we found that riparian fire severity increased with increasing upland fire severity, and that riparian fire severity was also mainly controlled by factors associated with moisture gradients. And that was position in a watershed in the Biscuit Fire, the headwater versus main stem stream channels, and elevation and plant association in the B&B Complex Fire. The more moist, higher elevation mixed conifer sites versus the drier, lower elevation ponderosa pine sites. Any questions on that so far? We have one question coming in here, so I'll pause for a minute. And the question here is, I've heard people suggest that fire severity has a lot to do with weather conditions, and I know that's difficult to measure, but do you have any thoughts on that? Yes, I do think that that relationship between upland and riparian fire severity partly reflects that they're burning at the same time of day under the same weather conditions, and that's part of the reason that the fire severity is similar between riparian areas and uplands. So yes, and the fire weather in some cases probably resulted in more or less severe fire in a given day. That's why I did want to stratify by fire severity, by broader fire severity, to make sure I was capturing that variation in fire weather and conditions under which the fire burned in the riparian areas and uplands. All right. If there are no other questions, I'll move on to the third and final research question, which is what factors are associated with post-fire riparian vegetation recovery. So I measured post-fire recovery both 2 and 4 years post-fire in both fires. I'm going to mainly stick to the 2-year results here and give you a little update on the 4-year results at the end. I recorded all regenerating woody plant stems by species within 2 meters of the stream, and determined whether individuals were sprouts or seedlings, and also did an estimate of shrub cover by species. And to analyze the patterns in species composition and abundance in these regenerating riparian plant communities, I used an ordination method called non-metric multidimensional scaling. So I'm going to be showing you some ordination figures, but hopefully I can make sense of them for you, so bear with me. But we did have a number of potential environmental variables explaining the ordination patterns, which were very similar to the variables we used in the previous analysis on fire severity that I just talked about. So this are some results for the Biscuit Fire, just to give you some idea of the general level of regeneration 2 years after the fire. We have seedlings at the top, sprouts in the middle, shrub cover at the bottom. You will note that the axis for the sprouts, it goes from 0 to 15,000. So it's about 10 times that of the seedlings. So the sprouting response was really huge in both fires, actually. We do have, I just want to explain, stream class 1 on the left is actually the largest, and stream class 3 is the smallest. So it goes from large to small, from left to right. Let's see. So, and I should mention the class 1 streams are the fish-bearing streams with steady flow, whereas the class 3 streams have relatively few fish and low flow. We generally found that the highest seedling density was along the largest streams, and red alder was the most common seeded species along all stream classes. Willow seedlings were also really common. Then in the drier sites, we had seeded species like white-leaf manzanita and ceanothus coming in. The conifer seedlings are in orange, and the conifer seedlings were most abundant along the smaller streams, and most of those were Douglas fir. And sprout number actually increased with decreasing stream size, so we found the most sprouts along the smallest streams. And we found more sprouts of drier site species along those small streams, like salal, Oregon grape, and tan oak being some of the most abundant ones. And we also found shrub cover was higher along those smallest streams. And the mean shrub cover for all stream classes was about 11% 2 years post-fire. These are the same results for the B&B Complex fire, except instead of stream size on the x-axis, we have the plant association, so ponderosa pine, dry mixed conifer, and wet mixed conifer. So in the B&B, we found the highest seedling density was in the riparian areas of the wet mixed conifer plant association. Conifer seedlings compose a relatively high proportion of seeded species, and Engelmann spruce were the most common. Some common deciduous species were willow, alder, and ceanothus. Found that sprout density was highest in the ponderosa pine plant association, where there was the greatest deciduous hardwood component. And then the shrub cover varied little by plant association. The mean shrub cover across plant associations is about 18% 2 years post-fire. All right. Okay, so here we've got, these are species codes in our ordination space, but I'm going to try to make this a little bit clearer. We saw that the patterns associated with this ordination were mainly associated with stream size and elevation and exposed mineral soil, because we saw higher exposed mineral soil at higher elevations. And so we saw greater regeneration of riparian associated species such as red alder, ocean spray, willow, occurring along larger streams and at lower elevations, and in places with lower fire severity. So basically these deciduous hardwood communities were replacing themselves. Whereas we saw greater regeneration of upland associated species along smaller streams and at higher elevations and in locations with higher fire severity. So this is for the Biscuit Fire. And we also saw greater conifer regeneration along smaller streams in those higher elevation locations and locations with higher fire severity. So we had, again, these deciduous hardwood dominated communities replacing themselves, and these higher elevation conifer dominated communities replacing themselves. And we also saw that the regeneration of species that were abundant in wetter environments were positively associated with pre-fire deciduous hardwood basal area. So we had these high moisture species in locations with higher pre-fire deciduous hardwood abundance. So overall, back to these illustrations, we found in these headwater streams, relatively high stream gradient, low deciduous hardwood composition that experienced relatively high fire severity, that there was greater regeneration of upland-associated species, including conifers. Whereas along these larger streams with lower stream gradient, higher deciduous hardwood composition that had relatively low fire severity, there was greater regeneration of riparian-associated species like alder and willow. Moving on to some results from the B&B Complex fire. Here we've got the plot. Each of these dots represents a plot in regenerating species space. But I mainly just wanted to show that the ponderosa pine plots were distinct from the, I'll go back to that for a second, from the dry and wet mixed conifer plots in terms of species composition. And again, we generally found a greater component of deciduous hardwoods in the riparian areas in the ponderosa pine plant association. But going back to the species in plot space, we found that these patterns were associated with elevation and exposed mineral soil, and thus mainly plant association, and that there was greater regeneration of species associated with the dry and wet mixed conifer plant associations like ceanothus, currant, and thimbleberry at higher elevations, while the regeneration of species associated with ponderosa pine, such as ninebark, was greater at lower elevations. And we also found that we had some patterns associated with the pre-fire conifer basal area. So what was the pre-fire composition of the riparian area? So in areas with greater pre-fire conifer basal area, we found more regeneration of conifers, whereas the areas with greater pre-fire hardwood composition had greater regeneration of hardwood species. So again, this pattern of hardwoods replacing hardwoods and conifers replacing conifers. And this is one other way to look at it, which is by regeneration strategy. So we basically found that with more pre-fire conifer basal area, there were more cedars, which were mainly conifers. Whereas if there was more pre-fire hardwood composition, we had more sprouters. So going back to these figures for the B&B Complex fire, and the dry and wet mixed conifer plant association, where we're at higher elevations, more steep topography, higher conifer basal area, and that generally saw more soil damage. We had higher regenerations of conifers and other cedar species. Whereas in the ponderosa pine at lower elevations, higher hardwood composition, more overstory fire damage, we saw higher regeneration of deciduous hardwood species. So overall, looking at vegetation recovery in riparian areas in both fires, we saw that the core scale control was really the moisture gradient or elevation gradient position in a watershed. In the Biscuit Fire, the smaller headwater streams versus those main stem streams. And then the plant association or basically elevation gradient in the B&B Complex fire, going from the higher elevation streams in the wet mixed conifer to lower elevation streams in the Ponderosa Pine Plant Association. And then at a finer scale, we saw differences with fire severity and whether the site was dominated by hardwoods or conifers before the fire. And as I mentioned, I did look at recovery 4 years after the fire to see how patterns may change over time. There was really minimal mortality in the riparian areas between the second and fourth year. There wasn't a significant increase in shrub cover in the plots, but the cover, the shade over the stream did increase over time. There were significant increases in seedling and sprout densities, but basically the factors associated with these recovery patterns that I just showed you remain the same between the second and fourth year. So some overall messages from this work. We saw that these understory fire severity, the soil damage was basically lower in riparian areas compared to uplands, but the mortality was not different from uplands. And again, this is likely due to higher moisture in riparian areas, but also the species composition. The hardwoods in riparian areas have low height to live crown and are highly susceptible to fire. And so even if fire severity, if the fire is not burning with as much intensity in the riparian areas, it's still causing as much mortality. We did see that strong association again between the riparian fire severity and upland fire severity. And we saw that both the fire severity and post-fire vegetation recovery patterns were controlled by these factors associated with elevation and moisture gradients. But we also saw this incredible resilience of this riparian vegetation. And this suggests that the functions of these riparian areas are going to be sustained despite the disturbance. And just a few implications of this work. If we were going to try to predict how a riparian area is going to burn, we could potentially use this elevation and moisture gradient information to predict riparian fire severity. And the strong association between riparian and upland fire severity suggests that fuels treatments in the uplands could potentially reduce the riparian fire severity as well. And then after a fire, again, this elevation and moisture gradient information could be used to target riparian areas for post-fire rehabilitation. But again, we did see that there was this incredible regeneration after the fire in these riparian plant communities, suggesting that maybe rehabilitation activities may be unnecessary to ensure the riparian forest function into the future. I did want to acknowledge funding. This project was funded by the Cooperative Forest Ecosystem Research Group, which was a cooperative with BLM, USGS, Oregon State, and ODF. And I'd be happy to take any questions. And also wanted to let you know that this work is published, and if you're wanting any more information on any of this, you can take a look at these, and I'm happy to pass them along.
Thanks, Jessica. Do we have any questions for Jessica? We have some time left for some questions. I have noticed that some people have started typing and then nothing came across, so I assume maybe their questions were answered as they were asking them. So here comes Oh yeah, there's a few coming in here now, so. Okay, there's Pam's question.
Okay, so the question is, I would be fascinated to see how the effects you observed compare to the results when people have intervened in some way, either logging or restoration or both. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is there any further research planned? I guess you would be referring to logging or restoration before the fire or after the fire. She's typing. Oh, after the fire. Oh, in the regeneration. Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't believe we had salvage logging going on all around us in both fires as we were doing the sampling, but none of it occurred, in the riparian areas. And I don't believe that is permitted. And so I don't think it would affect the riparian regeneration because we were looking, within a couple meters of the stream. So I'm sure it would affect regeneration in the upland plots, but not necessarily in the riparian areas. And we didn't really see a lot of restoration, riparian restoration going on, at least in that time frame. We were looking at that 2 years after the fire. So I think some of the bear treatments would be occurring within a couple months of the fire. So I didn't really see much of that either. Okay. And let's see. We've got another question. Could you explain your statistical modeling anymore? Yeah, sure. We can go. Let's see. I have to flip through all the slides. Do it real quick here. Okay, so look at these. So, yeah, so we didn't want to have overly complicated models with, because of the sample size, we couldn't have too many candidate models. So we're trying to keep the number of candidate regression models within reason. So I think we kept it to about 50. For that reason, we didn't do every combination of all 9 of these variables. And so that's why we said, for each model, we'll only choose one variable representing any of the categories, if that makes sense. So the candidate regression models, again, had they were 1, 2, or 3 factors. So sometimes it was just one of these factors, but only one fuels variable, one topography variable, and then upland fire severity. And the other question is, do we know if livestock grazing occurred on the sites during the course of the study? Not on the Biscuit Fire, because there's not a lot of livestock grazing there. On the B&B, we saw signs of browsing, of ungulate browsing we assumed those were deer and generally not livestock. I didn't see signs of livestock on any of the plots. That doesn't mean that it didn't occur, but I don't think it was extensive. Oh, and yeah, there are no cattle allotments in the B&B. There we go. But it was a fact. We did see quite a bit of browsing in the plots in the B&B. So the other question is, I like the plot showing sprouters, bankers, and seeders. Have you thought about looking more widely at variation, changes in plant traits between locations and severities? Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. We did try to explore it a little bit more, but I guess didn't get very far. Didn't really see any more patterns we thought were interesting. But yeah, it is kind of interesting to think about it that way. Looks like we have another question coming in here. Maybe not.
Was there another question coming in? Yes.
Okay, the question is, did you see any differences in riparian areas downslope of ponderosa pine stands that had already been treated prior to the fire? Not in the riparian areas. There was certainly management in these uplands and riparian areas prior to the fire. We couldn't account for it in most cases, and I didn't see signs of extensive logging in any of the sites. But we post-fire couldn't really account for pre-fire management, so that was likely contributed to some of the noise. Okay.
Any more questions? It doesn't look like it. Well, Jessica, thank you very much for spending your morning presenting this research. And we will post this on Northwest Fire Science Consortium website, and it'll link to our YouTube page, so you'll be able to look at it later, or we'll forward out the link to folks. And thank you very much. There is Matt Davies is typing again. There's our website for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. Thanks, Carrie. Another question.
Any differences in invasive plants between sites and locations? That's okay. I like the questions. No. We didn't actually see a lot of invasive plants in the riparian areas. So, and I would think that some of the differences would probably be in the grasses and forbs, which we did not measure. It didn't account for. So since we only looked at the woodies, we didn't see any differences. Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Jessica, very much. And everyone, thank you for joining us and participating. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks. It'll be looking at spring Chinook and bull trout and influences of fire and climate change. So hope you can all join us then. Thank you very much.